In 1967, somewhere in the American Midwest, a grandmother got into her car for a long drive she had made many times before. She knew the route, she knew where the state line was, and she knew that once she crossed it and made her purchase and turned back for home, she would be, in the strict eyes of the law of her own state, a smuggler, running contraband across a border, risking a fine, and technically, jail. There was no liquor in her bag, no drugs, no guns, nothing you would recognize as dangerous. She was driving across a state line to buy butter-colored margarine, and she was smuggling it home into the state of Wisconsin, where selling that innocent yellow tub had been a crime for the better part of a human lifetime. Understand how strange this is. Not 100 years earlier, well within living memory, one of the most ordinary things in your kitchen, the pale spread you scrape across toast without a second thought, was the subject of federal taxes, state bans, criminal penalties, and a law in several states that it be dyed the color of something dead. Grown men in government called it an abomination. A grandmother had to run it across a border in her handbag. So here is the question this video answers. How did a cheap tub of processed fat, a food invented, quite literally, to feed the poor and the army of an emperor, become the most fought over, most legislated against, most criminalized food in modern history? And why did the people fighting hardest to destroy it turn out, in the cruelest twist of all, to be a little bit right? To find out, we have to go back to a hungry France and a very worried emperor in the 1860s. The emperor was Napoleon III, nephew of the famous one, and he had a problem that has toppled governments throughout history. His people did not have enough to eat. Butter, in particular, was expensive and scarce. It spoiled quickly, it cost too much for the poor, and it was difficult to supply to an army on the march. And Napoleon, with a war against Prussia looming, needed to feed both his soldiers and his cities cheaply. So, in the 1860s, he did what rulers sometimes do when they need a miracle. He offered a prize, a public reward to any inventor who could produce a cheap, stable substitute for butter. One man answered, a French chemist named Hippolyte Mege-Mouries. Say it, Hippolyte Mege-Mouries, ESS. Working at an imperial farm, Mege-Mouries experimented with beef fat, rendering it, purifying it, and churning it together with milk until he produced a soft, pale, spreadable substance that looked and behaved remarkably like butter at a fraction of the cost. In 1869, he patented it. He needed a name, and here the story gives us its first small piece of poetry. Under his microscope, the purified fat formed in tiny, shining, pearl-like droplets. So he reached for the Greek word for pearl, margarite, and the Latin word for beef fat, and he called his invention oleomargarine. Say it, oleomargarine, the pearl of the ox. It was, on paper, exactly what the emperor had asked for: cheap, stable, nourishing, a gift to the poor and the army alike. Word of it spread with astonishing speed. Within a few years, dozens of companies were producing the stuff. The American writer Mark Twain, traveling in the 1880s, recorded overhearing a businessman boast that his factory-made fat could be shipped anywhere in the country and sold as pure butter, and that the customer would never know the difference. That was the promise, and the threat, in a single sentence: a food that could wear another food's face, and almost nobody wanted it. The French public shrugged, its armies ignored it. Napoleon's empire itself collapsed in war shortly afterward, and the emperor's clever butter went nowhere in the land of its birth. Mege-Mouries, the inventor, sold his process to a Dutch company for a modest sum, and largely faded from the story. That Dutch firm would one day grow into part of the giant we now call Unilever. But Mege-Mouries himself did not get rich. He had invented a food that would eventually sit in billions of refrigerators, and he sold it cheaply and stepped away. That pearl of the ox had been born in France and ignored. But an ocean away, in a young and hungry and fast-growing country, it was about to find the fight of its life. Because in America, margarine did not just threaten to feed the poor, it threatened to ruin some very powerful men. Margarine crossed the Atlantic in the early 1870s, and it arrived at the perfect moment to make enemies. America was industrializing. Its cities were swelling with immigrants and workers who needed cheap food, and margarine was gloriously, threateningly cheap, often half the price of butter, or less. For a poor family, that was not a small thing. That was the difference between having something on the bread and having nothing. But America was also a country with a vast and politically powerful dairy industry, millions of farmers, whole states whose economies rose and fell on butter and milk. And those farmers looked at this cheap, pale imitation, this factory-made grease pretending to be their honest product, and they saw not competition, but a mortal threat. So they went to war. And it was not a war of advertising, or price, or quality. It was a war fought with the law. The language they used tells you how deep the feeling ran. A governor of Minnesota declared that the ingenuity of depraved human genius had culminated in the production of oleomargarine and its kindred abominations. A senator from the dairy state of Wisconsin thundered that butter should come from the dairy, not from the slaughterhouse. This was not framed as business. It was framed as a crime against nature and against the moral order of the American table. Worse for the margarine makers, the dairy lobby was extraordinarily good at politics. In 1886, it persuaded the Congress of the United States to pass the Margarine Act, a federal law that placed a tax of 2 cents on every pound of margarine and forced manufacturers to buy expensive licenses simply to make it. Think about what that means. The national government of the United States was persuaded to step into a kitchen table rivalry between two spreads, and to put its full weight on the side of the more expensive one, to tax the cheap food that helped the poor, specifically to protect the profits of the people selling the costly one. Yet that was only the federal law. The real strangeness happened in the states. The dairy states understood something clever about their enemy. Margarine's whole trick, its one great vulnerability, was that it was pretending. Left to itself, margarine is not yellow. It is a pale, unappetizing, grayish-white. It only looks like butter because someone adds a yellow dye. Take away the yellow, and you take away the illusion. And a food that does not look like butter is a great deal harder to sell as butter. So the dairy lobby set out to control, by law, the one thing that mattered most: the color. And what they came up with was one of the strangest pieces of legislation in the history of food. If margarine wanted to be yellow, the dairy states decided, then the law would make it something else, something no human being would ever willingly spread on their morning toast. They passed laws requiring margarine to be dyed pink, bright, artificial, unmistakable pink. Vermont, New Hampshire, and South Dakota all passed versions of it. Other state legislators, not content with pink, seriously proposed that margarine be dyed red, or brown, or black, any color that would turn the stomach and kill the sale. The entire purpose was spelled out plainly by the people who wrote the laws. Margarine dyed pink would be, in their own word, unsaleable. nobody would buy a pink spread. That was the point. And the penalties were real. In some states, a merchant caught selling margarine in its natural, honest, unpink state could be fined $100, a serious sum at the time, or sent to jail for 60 days for selling the wrong-colored fat. Pause on the sheer strangeness of this. A government did not ban the spread outright. That might have looked too obviously cruel. Instead, it passed a law demanding that the food be made deliberately disgusting to look at. The state was not protecting anyone from poison. Margarine was not poison. The state was protecting the profits of one industry by legally mandating that its rival be painted the color of something you would throw away. The pink laws were so plainly absurd that they could not survive a serious legal challenge. In 1898, the United States Supreme Court struck them down. Its reasoning was almost comically simple. Pink, the court noted, is not the natural color of margarine, and a state cannot force a manufacturer to adulterate its own product, to add a foreign substance that renders it unsaleable, purely to help a competitor. Forcing a food to disfigure itself just to protect a rival went too far. There was a bitter irony in it. The same lawmakers who insisted margarine was a vile counterfeit were now passing laws to make it look vile, as though its ordinary pale color had not been insult enough. They did not trust the public to reject margarine on its merits, so they tried to legislate revulsion directly onto the plate. It tells you they were never really afraid the public would hate margarine. They were afraid the public would love it. So the pink laws died. But the dairy lobby had lost only one battle, not the war. They simply retreated to a subtler line. If they could not force margarine to be pink, they would at least forbid it from being yellow. And so, across dozens of states, the compromise settled into place. You could sell margarine, but only in its natural, off-putting, grayish-white state. You could not dye it the color of butter. That they could enforce. And this is where the story stops being about lawmakers and starts being about ordinary people in their own kitchens. Because the American public's response to being told they could not have yellow margarine was quiet, stubborn, and deeply human. They decided they would color it themselves. The margarine companies were clever, and they found a loophole in the wording of the law. The law said they could not sell yellow margarine. It said nothing about what the customer did with it at home. So they began selling their pale white margarine with a little extra something in the package, a small capsule or packet of intense yellow dye. The margarine came white and legal. The color came separately. And what happened next took place at millions of kitchen tables across America. You would take the soft white block and break the little capsule of deep orange-yellow dye over it, and then you would knead it, with a spoon, with a spatula, and very often, when nobody was looking, with your bare hands. You squeezed and folded, and worked the color through the pale fat, over and over, until the streaks disappeared, and the whole mass turned an even, convincing, butter-like yellow. It could take 20 minutes of squelching, monotonous work. It was usually given to the children, and it is remembered by an entire generation of Americans with a strange mixture of nostalgia and irritation. The great weekly chore of coloring the margarine, all because a law said the factory was not allowed to do the one simple thing the customer actually wanted. Let that settle for a moment. The state had not managed to stop people eating margarine. It had simply added a pointless, sticky, 20-minute ritual to the life of every working family that could not afford butter. The very people the whole thing was supposedly never about. The law did not protect them. It just made their dinner more tedious to prepare. And still the dairy states held the line. Across the first half of the 20th century, the map of America was a patchwork. Here you could buy it yellow, There you could not. Over there, you could not buy it at all. Margarine was legal, then taxed, then banned, then permitted, depending entirely on which side of an invisible line your kitchen happened to sit on. Two great forces finally began to crack that resistance, and both of them were disasters. The Great Depression made cheap food a matter of survival for millions who had once been comfortable. And then the Second World War brought butter rationing and put pale margarine in its little yellow capsule into the hands of families who had never touched it before, and who discovered, to their surprise, that it was not the abomination the governors had promised. The war did what decades of argument could not. It made margarine ordinary. But one state was not ready to surrender. Not in the 1940s, not in the 1950s, not even close. Wisconsin called itself America's Dairyland. It still does. The words are printed on its license plates to this day. And for Wisconsin, the war on margarine was not really about food at all. It was about identity and money and the livelihood of hundreds of thousands of farming families who had built a whole state on butter. So while the rest of the country slowly, grudgingly made its peace with the yellow spread, Wisconsin dug in. The federal government repealed its margarine taxes in 1950. State after state gave up their color bans through the 1950s and early 60s. Still, Wisconsin held. In Wisconsin, colored margarine remained illegal to sell, year after year, long after almost everyone else had let it go. That is what created the smugglers of Wisconsin. Because Wisconsin was not an island. Just across its borders, in Illinois, in Iowa, yellow margarine sat legally on the shelves, cheap and ready. So the people of Wisconsin did the obvious thing. They drove. Families made regular runs across the state line, buying yellow margarine by the armful and smuggling it home, breaking the law with every tub. It became an open secret, a routine piece of ordinary law-breaking. Ministers' wives did it. Grandmothers did it. There are accounts of people crossing the line and buying it 100 pounds at a time for themselves and half their neighborhood. The state of Wisconsin was, in effect, criminalizing its own citizens for the crime of wanting their toast to look normal, and its citizens were cheerfully ignoring it. It could not last, and everyone knew it. By the 1960s, the law was a national joke, an embarrassment defended only by the raw political muscle of the dairy farmers. Finally, in 1967, more than 80 years after the first federal tax and decades after nearly every other state had moved on, Wisconsin surrendered. Colored margarine became legal to sell in America's Dairyland at last. At last, the grandmother in her car could buy her butter-colored tub at the shop down the road and drive home a law-abiding citizen. And even then, the dairy state could not quite let go completely. For years afterward, a curious rule lingered on the Wisconsin books. Margarine could not be served in a restaurant, a hospital, or a prison in place of butter unless the customer specifically asked for it. The last, stubborn echo of a war that had lasted the better part of a century. So you might think, at this point, that the story has a clear villain and a clear victim, the greedy dairy lobby, twisting the law to crush a cheap food that helped the poor. The humble margarine, the people's honest spread, vindicated at last. And for most of this story, that is exactly right. But the final chapter is where it turns, because the men who spent a century calling margarine dangerous were wrong about why. And, by pure accident, they were also right. Their war had always been about money, and everyone eventually understood that. For 100 years, the case against margarine had been a lie dressed as morality, fake, unnatural, a fraud, the lobby called it. But they never had a real health argument, because in those early days, there simply wasn't one. Margarine was just cheap fat and milk. But somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, margarine changed. And the change came, ironically, from the effort to make it healthier. The old margarine had been made from animal fat, beef tallow. As the century went on, manufacturers switched to vegetable oils, which were cheaper and seemed cleaner. But vegetable oils are liquid at room temperature, and margarine needs to be solid. So the food scientists reached for a process called partial hydrogenation, forcing hydrogen through the oil to stiffen it into a spreadable block. That process created something new, a kind of fat that had barely existed in the human diet before. We now call them artificial trans fats. Here is the cruel irony at the heart of this whole story. For decades in the 20th century, doctors and health authorities told the public that butter, with its saturated animal fat, was the dangerous choice, and that margarine was the heart-healthy alternative. People switched to margarine believing they were protecting themselves. Health-conscious families spread it on their children's toast precisely because they had been told it was the responsible thing to do. And they were being poisoned, slowly, quietly, by the very thing sold to them as the safe option. Because when the science finally caught up in the 1980s and 90s, it found that artificial trans fats were among the most harmful things a person could eat. Not neutral, not slightly bad. Actively, measurably deadly, raising the risk of heart disease more reliably than almost any other component of the modern diet. The trans fats in that heart-healthy spread were clogging arteries and driving heart attacks on a massive scale. And the scale was not small. For decades, trans fats sat in margarines, in fried food, in the packaged baked goods of an entire civilization, quietly raising the risk of the single biggest killer in the developed world. Researchers came to estimate that artificial trans fats had contributed to hundreds of thousands of deaths. A slow, invisible toll gathered one clogged artery at a time, across the very generations that thought they were eating carefully. The regulators, when they moved, did not mince words. The United States eventually determined that artificial trans fats were not safe to eat in any amount, and banned them from the food supply, a ban that took full effect in 2018. Officials estimated the removal would prevent thousands of fatal heart attacks every single year. So the dairy farmers who spent a century screaming that margarine was dangerous were, in the end, accidentally, grotesquely correct. They were right for entirely the wrong reasons. They never knew a thing about trans fats. They just wanted to protect their profits. But the food they hated really did turn out to carry a hidden killer. They were lying, and the lie happened to be true. Go and open your refrigerator. There is a good chance that somewhere in the door, next to the eggs and the half-empty jars, sits a tub of margarine or spread. It cost you almost nothing. You have never once thought of it as controversial. You certainly have never thought of it as contraband. But hold it a moment and look at what is actually in your hand. You are holding the answer to an emperor's prize, a cheap fat invented to feed the poor and the armies of a France that no longer exists. In your hand is a substance that men in government once called an abomination against nature. You are holding a food that was taxed like liquor, banned like a drug, and ordered by law to be dyed the color of something dead so that no one would buy it. In it is the reason a grandmother once became a smuggler. The reason children across a continent spent their Saturdays kneading orange dye into white grease with their bare hands. The thing an entire American state criminalized for the better part of 100 years in the name of protecting butter. And in your hands is the quiet ghost of everyone who ate the trans fat version and trusted it. who chose it, carefully, because they had been told it was the safe and modern and responsible thing to spread on their children's bread. The people for whom the health food turned out to be the hidden danger. That is the strange lesson folded into that ordinary tub. We are told, constantly, what is safe and what is dangerous, what is natural and what is fake, what is good for us and what is not. And we believe it, because we have to believe something. The dairy lobby was sure margarine was an abomination. The doctors were sure it was the healthy choice. The families were sure they were protecting their hearts. And every single one of them was, in their own way, confidently, completely wrong. The tub in your fridge is safe now. The poison was taken out of it years ago. It is just ordinary fat again, the emperor's pearl, doing the humble job it was invented to do. But it remembers being the most dangerous food in America. 2 different times, for 2 completely different reasons. And almost nobody who buys it today knows either one. That is the true history of margarine. The fake that an empire prized, a nation outlawed, and a grandmother smuggled home in the dark. If this was worth your time, subscribe. There's a new one every week, and the next ordinary thing in your kitchen has a story just as strange. And tell me below, what food do you remember your family arguing over? I read every comment.